Hello and welcome to this 4IT techELITE webinar in association with InfinityWorks, the mobile Google Analytics ecosystem. My name is John Edwards and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Matt Wilson. Matt is a senior consultant at InfinityWorks. He's spent over 30 years in tech, often bridging between engineering and the product. He's passionate about working with product owners, helping them to get the best out of the tools available, but his chief passion is working with engineers. We had been due to welcome for the Q&A session Einho Marino, who played a key part in building Matt's presentation with him today, but it turns out she's unable to join us today, but she sends her apologies to everyone. You will no doubt have questions to ask as this presentation proceeds. Please do put them directly into the chat function in your GoToWebinar dashboard in real time as these questions come to you. And during the Q&A at the end of the webinar, Matt will deal with as many as we have time for before we close the webinar at 7 o'clock. So I'll hand over the screen to Matt. Welcome, Matt Wilson.
Thanks very much. So my talk today is about mobile analytics, and I'm from InfinityWorks. I've worked as a consultant and a contractor for a lot of my career, and one thing I've really sort of realized further down the track is that the tooling that we use, and that's not just something like Google Analytics, for instance, but also things like Jira. And lots of the tooling that we use is developers, but tools that we either input into or we share with product are often not that well understood by the people who are using them. They sort of understand them on a fairly day-to-day level, but they often miss some of the functionality that you can actually get out of these things and some of the ways that you can set them up in ways that can make life better for everybody. So that's really what got me into looking at Google Analytics and that whole analytics ecosystem, in that I went from various roles to roles, and every time I encountered analytics, well, I'd learn a bit more, and secondly, as I went, I'd see areas where I felt there was sort of room for improvement in the implementation that I saw in that particular gig. And I think if you're out there and you're an IT contractor, a consultant, or even a permanent member of staff, you know, remember that the skills you have, so logical analysis, understanding software, you write software yourself, you're used to using complex tools. I mean, some of those skills can be applied in ways that don't just help your immediate development team and the engineers that you're working with day to day, but also you can use to advise and help the business on how those tools can be used in the most effective way and in the best way for them to get the information they want. And that's really what kind of motivated me to get more and more into Google Analytics ecosystem. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through all of the tools that you can use to set up Google Analytics for mobile end to end, from the very beginning through to what kind of data you can get and what the legal considerations are. And to do that, I'm just going to use a example app that I've knocked up quickly, and this is just an online shopping app where you can buy cat flaps. So it's called Flap. Okay, so if you're about to launch an app like that, it's new in the market, and you're in the business, what are you supposed to do about Google Analytics? Like, how do you set that up in such a way that it's going to tell you whether or not you're achieving what you set out to achieve? How do you know whether or not changes that you make to the app are actually going to, sorry, that's better. Yeah, the changes that you make in the app are actually going to be effective, and they're actually going to do the kind of things that you want them to do. So within circles of people who really understand the analytics ecosystem, the first bit of advice you're always going to get is that the business needs to write a tracking plan. So what is a tracking plan? So a tracking plan is basically a document or a wiki page or a spreadsheet, which is a record of what you're trying to track, why you're trying to track it, and how you're going to track it. Now, most of the time you're not going to be able to think about all of this up front, but the first thing you should probably do if you're going to launch an app is sit down and just think about, you know, what are your KPIs as a business, what are you trying to achieve, and what are the things you want to focus on when you're measuring user interactions on a mobile app. So what does a tracking plan actually look like? Okay, so this is just a really basic example, and using the example of the cat flap app Flap. The business may know that what they really want to do is they want to increase customer satisfaction. And the second thing is they've got a new range of smart cat flaps that they want to increase customer awareness about, and to make sure the customers know that that product line is available. So with starting with that kind of like what part, you can then go into, right, okay, well, how am I actually going to measure this? What user interactions am I going to look at to make sure that I am increasing the customer satisfaction? In this case, you could look at the App Store rating, for instance. Now, you can, as the business, they can go and look at that in the App Store and measure it from there. So that's fine. But Google Analytics is already measuring lots and lots of other user interactions with the app. And my view is that Google Analytics is the best place for all the interactions that are going to be looked at by the business, because everything, so much is already there already. You can really augment that information by putting your own custom data that you're collecting from the app through the analytics sort of data pipeline. So you can easily do this using events on mobile. So basically within your code, you can generate events, and you can use any kind of conditional logic in that code to do so. So you can even have really complex use cases like, you know, they pressed this button and then they went through to this screen and they put this search term in and things like that. You know, if you can track it in the code, you're then capable of generating an event that describes that particular journey. If you want to do that, and then you can send that back and it can be reported on in Google Analytics. So it's a really good way of getting everything into one place. Another sort of use case is this increasing awareness of smart cat flaps. So in this case, you might say, all right, well, we want to have a look at who's searching for those kind of terms, who's searching for smart cat flaps. And again, you can create an event that records not only that a search has happened and trigger that off, send it to Google Analytics, but also what keywords the user searched from. So you can do some analysis of those as well. Now, a lot of the time, what I've seen is that's a really good example of the kind of thing that's often recorded by the back end, by your back end applications. The downside of doing that kind of thing is that over time, the back end can end up doing all these crazy bespoke implementations to record user interactions, sending them off to different stakeholders, integrating with different systems. And what you're really doing is you're just adding loads of services that can all basically are doing what you can already effectively do using the Google Analytics ecosystem, and have nothing in the back end that you have to maintain, because Google Analytics will take care of all of it. So there's lots and lots of different use cases, and really sort of the sky's the limit. As I say, if you can do it in the code, then you can create events and you can record it in analytics. Now, when you create an event, it has a name, and you can create your own custom events. So the first one here for the App Store rating, we've called app_rating. For the second one, the event's called search. Every time the user, in this case, does a search, and this would be the logic, every time they do a search, that event is triggered and is sent back kind of as a record to Google Analytics. Now, the event can also have a set of parameters which can tell you more details about what happened when the event occurred. So for instance, we could have for search, we could have a parameter called keyword, and it's a key value pair. So the key would be keywords, and then the value would be the search string they typed in. With this one, it's another key value pair. The key is rating, and then the value is a numeric value, which would be the rating that they did in the App Store. Okay, so how does the whole Google Analytics ecosystem fit together? So basically, everything from a mobile app is really being directed through Firebase and then into Google Analytics. So what is Firebase? If there's any mobile developers out there, you'll know what Firebase is already. But for those who don't know, Firebase is Google's mobile backend as a service. And it encompasses a huge range of different functionality. So it's got everything from persistent stores for data, machine learning, authentication, and storage. Then it's got loads of tools that are absolutely critical to maintaining a fleet of applications out there, or a large fleet. So ways to analyze crashes and see how many crashes that you're getting from different versions of the app. You can look at performance. This one is extensively used, and this is being able to distribute apps to testers. There's also I can't see it on here, the ability to be able to see what versions of the app have been rolled out, because rollouts are incremental and usually happen over the case of several days. So you can have a look and you can see graphs that can tell you what versions are out in the field, whether your latest version is 50% deployed or 75% or whatever. There's messaging, the Google Analytics, as I've mentioned, and A/B testing, which I'll come on to. So there's a huge amount of functionality that Firebase can do, but it's only been fairly recently, in the last few years, that Firebase has become the sort of main conduit for data going to Google Analytics. Prior to this on mobile, there was an additional Google Analytics SDK, which you generally install in your app, that would send the information separately. Now they've rolled it all up together, and they're trying to consolidate things, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. Now, another tool that's really important to the business as part of this ecosystem, and it's important to note that you may find that it's not just the Google ecosystem you might find when it comes to mobile analytics. There's an Adobe equivalent to a lot of these things as well, and there's probably others out there that I'm not aware of, but Google's the one that I've spent the most time with myself. So Google Tag Manager. So what is Google Tag Manager? Basically, the business got a bit fed up of whenever they wanted to change things that they were measuring. So just going back to my events I was talking about before, say the business decides that they want to not call that event parameter rating score anymore, they want to just call it rating, for instance. Now, back in the bad old days, that would mean a code change, and that's often very frustrating for the business and for product managers, because they then have to get the code change into a Jira ticket, stick it on the backlog, wait for it to get prioritized. It's often not like a high priority thing. And as a result, it might take weeks or even months to get that tiny code change made just to rename their event. But what Google Tag Manager can do is it gives them a UI, and within that UI, they can actually define triggers and tags. So a trigger is basically a user interaction on the app, which will result in something happening. So you can set them up here, and they're set up in the cloud. And what happens is the GTM SDK, which is in your app, will download that config. So when you change it, one of the first things it will do when you open the app, it'll try and pull down the latest config. Now, there's also a locally stored version of the config, which you generate from the UI, and you put in the app just in case the mobile can't connect. So it may be slightly out of date, but at least it's got something in there. And that defines the triggers, which are the user interactions that will cause it to want to do something. So when it detects one of these triggers, and that can be from the app behavior, it can also be from Firebase, because there's a shared message queue, which isn't shown here, which Firebase uses to communicate things like automatic events that haven't been specified when they happen. So GTM can, if a GTM has a trigger configured by that user, it can then respond to that event. And what GTM does is it's really like tags can be thought of as kind of an integration action. So a tag can be used to do something like change the name of the event. A tag can be used to communicate with a third party, ping a URL, all kinds of different things. In the case of this diagram, this is a third-party application which is used for ad attribution called AppsFlyer. Now, what AppsFlyer usually do is say, oh, can you install our SDK? The only problem with that is it's sending more data back to AppsFlyer. So the only problem with that is that SDK is more space. So when you're downloading the app is bigger, then you've got the overhead of running the SDK. But Google Tag Manager, we can effectively get rid of this over time, because Google Tag Manager already has support for AppsFlyer within it. And again, you're just using triggers. And in this case, the tag that's fired is the tag to send data to AppsFlyer. So if you go into an engagement and you find that Firebase is being used, maybe Google Analytics, but Tag Manager is not being used, certainly if I'm in that situation, I'll always say, oh, do you know about this? Here's what it can do. Here's how you can use it to actually empower yourself as the business to be able to configure the data that you're recording. It can't do everything, but it can do a lot. So I think a mature platform that's using Google Analytics, you'll often see Tag Manager, including on mobile. On web, it's even more richly featured, and it can do even more. And it can run insert scripts into the pages and things like that. On mobile, it's slightly different, but that's basically how it works. A Firebase, once it gets all the data, it forwards it onto Google Analytics, and in Firebase, you can configure a Firebase project to talk to one Google Analytics property. So these are both names for the instances. So Firebase is called a project, Google Analytics is called a property, and it's one-to-one relationship, which I'll explain why that's important in a minute. So BigQuery is Google's cloud database, key value type database that stores sort of unstructured data. And this is a really important part of the ecosystem as well, which I'll explain in a bit. Data Studio is kind of a visualization tool. It's really cool because you can do a lot of things in there that you just can't easily do in Google Analytics. It's a lot more extensible. It's kind of a bit like a Tableau light type thing. But once you've got your data going to BigQuery, it opens up a whole new realm of reports, dashboards you can create, things like that. And then the data from BigQuery you can also pull into your own systems, which is a huge advantage, which I'll come on to. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a bit about Universal Analytics and Google Analytics and properties. So I mentioned before that a property is in Google Analytics is really an instance of that. One Firebase project points to one property. Now, back in the day when Google Analytics was first created, it was created for web, and it was all based around page views being sort of the main kind of user interaction. So as you load a page, Google Analytics, the Google Analytics script that you put into your web page would then record that as a page view, and that's what most of your reporting was based around. And further on down the track, they started getting a bit more sophisticated. Obviously, they've got sessions, they've got events, but it's all based around web. Now, when mobile came along, well, mobile apps don't have page views in the same way, but they do have screens that you look at. They're quite different. I mean, they're not fetching a URL every time you go from one screen to another. So Google sort of recognized that there was going to need to be a new kind of model, and Universal Analytics, which was the main sort of property type that everybody used for Google Analytics, just wasn't going to do everything when you wanted to look at mobile as well. So Google have come up with a new property type, which is called App plus Web. And the goal that Google have got is to move away from Universal Analytics eventually and move everything to App plus Web. So rather than having your mobile data going through Firebase and being looked at in one Google Analytics property and your web stuff in another, and maybe your iOS and Android are separate, I think the vision now is that you'll have everything going into one Firebase project, one Google Analytics property. All that data's there. You can view it together in a consolidated way, or you can partition the data within that tool, so you can then look at iOS or Android or web separately if you want. So here on the right hand side, this is just the toolbar from Analytics 360, which is UA, Universal Analytics, and on the left hand side, and then on the right hand side we've got the new App plus Web. And what I wanted to just point out here was that the Universal Analytics has got a lot of customization options. So it's really, really good for dashboards and things like that. Web Plus app doesn't do that anymore, doesn't do that at the moment, because as you can see at the top, it's only a beta. So it's quite immature when compared to Universal Analytics. So for mobile, it's really the only choice at the moment. So your property has to be App plus Web. But for web, it's probably better to, if you're thinking about moving your stuff across, it's probably better to keep it going to both at the moment, because your users will have a bit of a shock when they move to App plus Web, because it doesn't have all the functionality that they might be used to yet. And the other thing about App plus Web is that it gets rid of the whole idea of page views altogether, doesn't use them at all, and just uses events. So it sort of unifies the data model that's being used for mobile and for web. Everything is now based on events. And on the web, a page view is just like a screen view on mobile. It's just another event type. Okay, so this is how things were in sort of the bad old days as I see them. And here's our app. Here's the Apple version of the app. Here's the Android version of the app. Here's the Chrome version of the, web version of the app. And basically, you've got a different GTM account. So that's the instance for GTM, an account, confusingly. So a different GTM account for each one. And that's where you're configuring your tags and your triggers. That can then send interrupt data that's being sent to Firebase, where you've got a project for each of the mobile ones, and then you've got a separate property for each one. So you've got, if you're in the business and you need to find out how many active users did we have in the last month, what you have to do with this model is then go into each of these Google Analytics properties, look at the graph, write the number down or record the number, copy and paste, And basically that's just a massive pain when you have to do it very often, or you have to get information across all of the different things, adding them together. How many users have we actually got? You can't look at it in a consolidated way. The way things are now going, and this is something that I've been involved in, is eventually everything will just go through one Google Tag Manager account, one Firebase project, because Firebase is now starting to support web as well, and you can add web here. At the moment, we've just got the iOS and Android apps in a single Firebase project, and then that will then go to a single Google Analytics app plus web property. Now, as I said, I don't recommend that at the moment. I think at the moment you need to run for web. You basically need to run these two in parallel and still have universal analytics for your business. But the end goal, the strategy over time, as this becomes a more mature product, is going to be to move everything across to this event-based model and app plus web. Okay, so talked a bit about events, and hopefully I've made it reasonably clear that events are the user they record the user interaction, and they're the cornerstone of the new app plus web Google Analytics model, and they are the main way that you're going to be able to look at your user data and understand what your users are doing. So there are some limits on events though. So in instance, so in this case, an app instance is your Firebase and Firebase property, and your Firebase project in your Google Analytics property. You're only allowed 500 custom event types at the moment. So that's your event type there. So this is a custom event called app rating. This is one called search. So only 500. Now it may sound like a lot, but actually that can run out. So again, it's another really good reason for having this spreadsheet or this documentation, because it's the business who's going to be thinking about these events and what they need to measure. And it's often not just one person as well, because it can be marketing, it can be product, it could be analytics, and be all these different areas of the business who are interested in measuring things. And if they don't have a single place they can go to understand what's already being measured, you're just going to end up with a total mess of people requesting different stuff, not knowing it's already here. If you've got this document, this tracking plan, you've got a single point of reference that people can go to and go, right, we're already measuring search keywords, so I don't need to worry about trying to get that done again. I can use this and look at it in the report. And also, if they're looking in analytics or Firebase at the events, and they see when they don't understand the name, they can go back in here and they can look and they can understand what that means. So it's like a really handy guide for them when they're using analytics. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people who use Google Analytics in business, they're not technical people. They're often very, very far away from technique. If you've ever worked in marketing departments, they don't, some of them are obviously technical, but others just aren't, and they don't need to be. So it's very difficult for them to understand sort of the entropy that can come about from lots and lots of people trying to configure things without having some kind of overall coordinated view of what's going on. So as I mentioned, events can have parameters. In this case, app rating and rating score is the parameter. And events are only allowed a maximum of 25 per event, which I think is probably more than enough. That's an awful lot of data for that particular event. But these thresholds can be reached. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is there's only 100 parameters per project. So what that means is rating score, that's used one parameter. If you had another event which had a rating score parameter, that would not be treated as a separate thing. That's kind of a shared parameter. So you've got 100 of those that you can use across the entire project for all events. And 50 of those are text and 50 of those are numbers. So there's a little bit of planning that you've got to do around that, just to make sure you don't run out of text event parameters, for instance. And again, that's where the spreadsheet really helps. So what Firebase also does is it triggers off default events. And here's a list of these are the main ones that I've seen used in the past. There are some other ones as well. This isn't an exhaustive list. But the really important one here, and the one that most people care about the most, is screen view. And that's every single time you call up a different screen on your mobile app, it's going to trigger a screen view event. And here's how that will appear in the analytics raw data. So you have an event name, which will be screen_view, and there's the parameter, the key value pair. In this case, this screen's called product. Now, what's really important is, well, when people see this in a report, how are they going to know what that screen is? When they see product, are they going to know that's the screen where you go to buy cat flaps? Maybe not. So what's really, really important is that when you're naming your screens, you use good names. And product isn't a great name here, but use really clear names to sort of do what they say on the tin, so that when people are looking at this further down the track who have nothing to do with development, they're going to know what screen this actually means. And I've even gone so far in the past as actually spending like quite a lot of time doing a whole wiki page full of screenshots of all of the screens of the entire application and what the screen names were next to it. So it was a reference. And I don't necessarily recommend that because it doesn't really stay up to date, but you've got some, at least it's something, and it has proved useful. So people can go and actually look and say, right, what is this address change screen? Is it the address change screen in this user flow, or is it in this user flow? And actually work it out. So with your events, it's really important that you think a lot about the naming. And again, this is where that tracking plan really comes into its own. So one thing that's super important is that the event name is consistent across platforms. So particularly like the screen naming. So I have been in a gig where I got there and Google Analytics was already in use. It had been around for quite a long time. And what I found was that the screens were called completely different things in iOS and Android. And that's a massive problem when you're going to try and consolidate all the data into a single analytics property, because obviously you're not going to be able to see for any screen who's looking at it, because you're going to have two names, and it's just a bit of a nightmare. So that then involved a huge activity which I sponsored, and this is why I did this wiki page in the first place, which was to go through all of the naming, pull out all of the different names on the two platforms, share that with the business, ask them, okay, well, what do you think this screen should be called? Work out a naming, a nomenclature basically, and then write JIRA tickets to rename all of the screens so they were consistent across the two platforms, so that we could look at them in an aggregated way. If you get that right from the start, you're going to be in a much better place, and you're not going to end up with just a complete mess. So really important. Self-documenting, I think I've already mentioned, is really that does what it says on the tin. As much as possible, your events need to be obvious as to what they are without having to go and refer to anything, just like variables in code. Consistent action names. This is just a hygiene thing. Is it tap, click, or press when a user interacts with a button? Things like that. If you can think of that at first, or if you can look at that tracking plan, you can see what people have used, see what the convention is, and it just makes everything a bit tidier. And then lastly, that limitation about only having 50 event parameter value types, so of each type, sorry, so text, 50 text and 50 number, that can easily run out. So you need to give that a bit of thought, and where possible, if you can use numbers, use them up, because you're probably going to find that most of your things are text. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go through a practical example of how you can use Firebase in Google Analytics to do A/B testing, and how much easier it is when you use these tools to when you're using say your backend to try and do something similar. So how does A/B testing work with Firebase? So what happens, and I'll go into this in more detail, but basically Google Analytics, you can take measurements that are being made in Google Analytics, just go back, so you can take measurements that you can take in Google Analytics, and you can use them to help you come up with a design for an A/B testing experiment. So with A/B testing, you always have a new thing that you're trying to test, and ideally you also have a control group. So you're looking at the as-is application, and you're putting the new thing out there into the world, and you're seeing whether or not the new thing does has the effect that you desire. So Google Analytics is really good because it can suggest how to measure whether you're getting what you need, and you can then design your experiment. There's a backend as a service thing, so it's a remote config, so it's storing configuration parameters in the Firebase backend, and that can be used to determine whether or not, when the app gets this, to determine whether or not the app's going to show the new app version of the app, or the old version of the app, if you like. And then the user interactions there and the measurements then go back into analytics through Firebase, and the whole ecosystem will then automatically tell you whether or not the new test, the experiment, has been successful when compared to the control. So it takes care of a lot, as I'm going to show you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about this so you can see how easy it is to set up an A/B test on mobile using Firebase. So we're using a remote config. The first thing you do is just set up a parameter. So in this case, we're just going to add a demo button to the top of our app for some users, and we're going to see whether or not, in this case, we can use app rating, for instance. So a user's more inclined to trigger an app rating event and rate the app if they see this demo button, because they think the app's so good now with this demo button, they want to rate it. So the first thing you do is you set up a parameter, and it's really easy. Just fill out a form, and basically you can then put it into your remote config. So that at this point, once you've done the code in your mobile application, it's going to be able to fetch the value for that parameter from Firebase. And a little thing here, another thing that you can do is you can put some conditions around the parameter as well. Like for instance, you can put a time-bound condition where this parameter will only be available during certain dates. That's a Christmas campaign, for instance. Now, your app won't keep pinging Firebase every 2 seconds or 50 times a second to try and find out whether or not that parameter's changed. By default, it only does it once every 12 hours. And when it fetches that parameter, the value for that parameter down, it caches it for 12 hours. And this is just a code snippet. One of the first things you want to do is say, well, look, how long do I want to cache this parameter for? How volatile is it going to be? How much is it going to change? So in this case, we're caching it for an hour. And there's just some code. It's really easy to say, right, every hour, just go and do a check and see whether or not that parameter has changed. And then what you can do next in this next snippet of code is you just check that you can actually fetch the value for that parameter from the Firebase remote config. So as I mentioned, it was show demo button enabled. So all this is doing is just pulling it down, getting a Boolean, and just saying, you know, do I have this? And you can then check by just sending a log message, just saying, you know, have I got it? And at the moment that would be null, because we haven't false, sorry, because we haven't given a value to the parameter. But that just shows you that, you know, you can fetch it. So once you're satisfied that you're able to fetch it in the app, the next thing you can do is then go and create the experiment. And this is where Google Analytics comes into the piece. So what you initially want to do is you pick a very small amount of your user base. So when you're first going to run this experiment, what you do is you basically take a sample of the user base, and based on their interactions in that sample, you then decide whether or not you're going to roll it out. So here we've got an example where we're using 100% of eligible users. What would that probably generally we do is have a very, very low percentage. And we're probably only looking for something like a few hundred or maybe a few thousand users for, you know, an app that has millions of users. You might only want a few thousand, say, to run your experiment. And with goals, this bit here, this is where you can use your Google Analytics. So these are metrics that come from Google Analytics and Firebase: crash-free users, retention. And you can see here we've got screen view and app rating. So app rating was the one that I'd want to measure. So if I wanted to set up this event, I can literally, set up this measurement for the A/B test. I can literally put in the app rating event into here, and Firebase will then take care of the checking whether or not that changes as a result of the experiment for me. So I don't even have to go and count it up. I don't have to go and take a baseline now. I don't have to do any of those things. It'll all be taken care of. So I can put app rating in here. I can then have multiple variants. So I could put the button in lots of different places. I could have 4 variants. In this case, we've only got 2. And that's why we only need the Boolean. We've just got the control group where we're doing nothing, and the variant where we're putting a demo button. I'm just going to skip ahead so I can just show you that. So there you go. On the right, we've got the demo button, and that's how it's going to look like for 50% of the few thousand users that we're going to roll this out to. Okay. Oh, just a note, you can only have 24 running experiments at the same time in a Firebase project, and you can only have 300 experiments in total active in the config. This is just a bit where we're just putting the code in, that would check to make sure whether or not the show demo button enabled parameter was set to true. If it's set to true, the button's visible. If it's not true, the button's not going to be visible. So very basic. And what you then have to do before you actually roll this out to your few thousand users is just run a test for yourself. So in order to do that, what you do is you pull down a Firebase ID token. So Firebase actually creates a special ID for the instance of your app. So that's the app as it is installed on your phone, when that installation happens, it creates that instance ID, and that's what Firebase uses to identify your app, and that's what the Firebase SDK will pass back to Firebase. So you don't know what that is, but if you put this bit of code in, you can pull it down and stick it into your log, and you'll get a token like this, and that will tell you, what the Firebase instance ID is for your app. If you reinstall your app, this will get changed, but as long as your app stays installed, it'll stay consistent. What you can then do is go here to this screen in Firebase, and basically you can add, there's kind of a whitelist where you can add these instance IDs. So you can do it to any mobile device that you want to test, and you can choose whether it's in the control or whether to give it variant A, which is the demo button at the top. When you do this, you can then go to your devices and confirm that there's a test device that's receiving the experiment. You can go to your device and you can say, right, okay, it's working as expected. I've got one phone here that doesn't show the thing, and I've given the application instance ID to get the control. This other one, I've given the application instance ID to get variant A, which is the demo button. Once you're happy, you can then start to increase the number of users that are getting the two different options. And in this example, we're just looking at a few hundred users, but basically Firebase will then give you a screen that you can go to where you can see the users in real time as they're going through and viewing that particular screen. And it will tell you, based on the metrics that you've asked to record, the analytics metrics, it will tell you whether or not it thinks that things are improving, those metrics are going in a positive direction or not, and whether or not it thinks it's going to beat the baseline control group. So you could decide how many users you're comfortable with. So you might set it to go out to 3,000 users, but you might think, well, once I've seen 2,000, I'm happy to stop the experiment. So you can check it there. And there's a recommendation for 14 days. You can do it time bound, or you can do it based on number of users. It's up to you. Once you're happy, you can stop the experiment, and it will then make a recommendation. So based on the metrics and analytics that you said that you feel the ones that you want to measure, it will then say something like, right, look, here's a great improvement we found. This is the variant you should choose. In this case, obviously there was only the one apart from the control, but you can have as many as you want, and it will tell you the one that's performing the best with those metrics. Press the button, and it will then roll it out. There'll be this confirmation screen here where you just say, yep, this show demo button enabled true is the thing I'm going to roll out to everybody. And at that point, this parameter becomes something more like a feature flag. Obviously, later on, you can go into your code and you can get rid of that conditional logic, get rid of that Boolean because you're rolling it out to everybody. But at this point, it's basically a feature flag. And it's quite handy. You can turn it off later if there was a problem, and then to do the refactoring in a couple of months once it's bedded in, if you like. And that's it. And that's how you set up A/B testing in Firebase. So really, really easy. And from a coding perspective, it's trivial. Even I could do it. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is tracking individuals. And this is a big change that's happened with Google Analytics in the last couple of years. So it's still commonly believed that on mobile, and also on web actually, that you can't identify a user in Google Analytics, and that is actually no longer the case. It is possible to now send from mobile a unique identifier for the user that is persistent and is based on an ID that you as the developer choose. So typically this would be something like an internal ID that you use in your backend systems for that particular user that you've then encrypted using a hashing algorithm or something like that, so that it can go into the public domain and it's essentially meaningless from a point of view of being out in the public. But for you'll have a lookup table where you can then match it back to your internal ID. So you put it into the app, and there's a few lines of code, and that can be configured to send that hashed ID back through to Google Analytics, and that's called a user ID. What you can do with that user ID, you're not going to see it in your Google Analytics UI or anything like that. But what you can do in Firebase is, just as you can point Firebase to a Google Analytics project, you can also point Firebase to a Google Cloud project, and a BigQuery instance in there where all the raw analytics data will also be sent. So within BigQuery, you get one record for every single user interaction. That's every single screen, every event that you record, and there's a lot of rich data in that record. It's a hierarchical structure. You can pull out kind of JSON-like data. It uses SQL, so it's a bit clunky when it comes to doing queries of the nested bits. It does require an elevated Firebase license called a Blaze license to do this. But in larger organizations, if they're not already doing this, I really recommend looking into it because it opens up a huge new world for anyone who's doing data analysis and getting data from the back end. They're going to get all of the user interactions. They're going to get potentially the user IDs, and that's going to enable them to match that data back to their in their data warehouse. And they're going to get loads of stuff that you just wouldn't get otherwise about how users are interacting with the app, and they can match that to all their back-end data. It's a sea change in the kind of data that you can get about your users if you're not already doing it. I'm not going to go through this in huge detail, but as part of doing this, I did do a bit of an audit myself into all the different IDs that are actually pulled back by Firebase and Google Analytics. And aside from the user ID, which, as I mentioned, is a kind of encrypted version of your own back-end internal ID, there's also a huge number of other IDs that are generated in different cases, many of which can be reset. For instance, if you factory reset your device, a lot of these things are regenerated. Or if you uninstall apps, a lot of things are regenerated. But there's all kinds of different IDs, and these are all used as ways of being able to either track you or maintain a view of what you're doing over time. So when different events come through or different Firebase data comes through or crash data or things like that, which application is installed, all that stuff is used. So I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but it's in the slide deck. And it's quite eye-opening when you find out how much is actually being recorded. And that gets me onto GDPR. So what you may have found, and I've seen a lot of this recently, is that on web, and it seems to have got worse, when you go to websites at the moment, you're getting a banner coming up, and that banner usually says something like some stuff about cookies, and then there'll be a button that says accept all, and there'll usually be another button that says something like configure or more details or something like that. Now, when you press that accept all button, what you probably may not realize, or maybe you will because you work in IT, is that you're actually, by doing that, you're actually opting into a lot of things, a lot of data collection that you'd normally be opted out of. And usually if you want to opt out, you're either using some blocking software, or you have to press that more details button and go in and make sure that you're opted out in all the categories. And you'll see the categories are often called things like this: strictly necessary, performance, functional, marketing. Sometimes they have different names. But the important thing here is that default opt-in, according to the interpretation of GDPR for mobile that I've witnessed, the only things are some of the Firebase technology. So analytics is actually not by default opt-in with GDPR on mobile. It's only when that user presses accept all, that's the point when they're opting into analytics data being collected. And that's a recent change. And that's because the GDPR legislation is only just now starting to be applied for mobile, because it's very much written with web and cookies, things like that in mind. So I think every company's finding their own way at the moment. But it's just that if you do get inspired, hopefully, by what I've said, and you think, great, we can capture the user IDs, we can go to BigQuery, link it to the data warehouse, the business is going to be over the moon. Just remember that you're going to have to get your data governance people involved, because by default, users should be opted out of that data collection, and it's in a special category of its own. Sometimes that's marketing, sometimes it might be one of these others, but it's usually not performance. So often when you go and look, analytics is in the performance category. Often when you go and look at the definition of that, they make it very clear that the data is anonymized and you can't identify the user. So the user ID does really kind of change, even though that's also default opt-out. This is probably the most invasive of the options from a point of view of your privacy, and you're kind of moving this part of your analytics, the user ID collection, into this area. So what I've had to do in the past is implement code changes so that if they are opted out of that particular area, then the user ID is not sent. So bottom line is that these changes are going to affect analytics one way or another. And unfortunately, it means you're not going to collect data on all your users. But as long as you give users that choice and give them that kind of screen and enable them to opt out and understand what they're doing, I think that strikes a good balance and means that you can then do this user ID collection for analytics, which really does open things up. Okay, so I think I'm done. So I'm ready to go to the next step, I guess.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. That's fascinating. We have some questions. Do please continue to put your questions into the chat function in the GoToWebinar toolbar. First question, when developing any application, how do you overcome the problem of multi-platform design? Matt?
Is this from an analytics perspective?
I guess it is, yeah.
I mean, I could talk about it from a general perspective. And certainly this has been, I guess, recent experience. Very much similarly to what I said with analytics, very much try to standardize everything. So because I think heterogeneous apps, even if it's whether it's the user experience or sort of the back end, they just increase complexity. And I guess a really good rule of thumb in development is that simplicity is usually the best way to go, and you need to be, I guess, as parsimonious as you can. And I think that same sort of approach really does pay off if you're looking at something like mobile app development. I mean, you've already got the fact that you're developing on 2 different platforms. If you're doing native development using 2 different languages, things like that. So yeah, heterogeneity across the platforms is something I tend to try and promote.
Another question, how much does Google Analytics affect performance? And in particular, do the number and types of events analyzed make a significant difference to any impact on performance?
I've never run metrics on it, so I couldn't tell you whether it's significant or not. I mean, obviously, if you're downloading 2 SDKs, then that immediately has an impact on the size of the application, the download speed of the application. So it's potentially putting people off from downloading and installing it. And then, of course, when you're running it as well, and I would imagine that adding more events would at least scale it linearly. I'm sure that's probably what it does. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's why there's a restriction on numbers of events as well, and that might be I don't know whether it's a capacity thing on Google's side or not. Maybe there's some overhead to having lots of different events on the app itself because it's having to look them up or whatever. So I think generally speaking, though, it wouldn't be a big drain. That's my gut feeling, though. I've never actually tried it.
If you're going to use Google Analytics, do you, Matt, trust Google with your data?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I have actually worked at Google as a contractor, and fairly recently, and I did go in wondering, am I going to go behind the curtain and see some bad practices? And I was delivering a website, and I found them to be, as far as I could tell, they were trying very, very hard to do things by the book. They have a very large privacy group and very explicit rules. You have to go through every single field that you're collecting the users. You have to justify why you're collecting it. You have to have, I mean, this is all GDPR good practice anyway, but they were, to my mind, they were kind of ahead of the curve with it. You have to have a mechanism for it to be deletable if the users request it for it to be deletable. You have to mechanisms for it to be retrievable if they ask for it to, to see their data. Ideally in an automated way. It has to expire after a certain amount of time. I mean, there's lots and lots of things that you've got to put in place, even for something as simple as storing an email mailing list. All of that stuff's got to be in, and if it's not, then sorry, but you're not going to be allowed to do that kind of thing. So I think having been in there, I feel a lot better about Google. I think out of the large Silicon Valley companies, they're probably one of the ones that I trust the most, having been an insider.
How do you encourage teams to build in analytics as part of delivering new features? Most teams add it to the backlog. Do you agree with that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. It's usually last in priority, and if it goes into the backlog as a separate thing, often never gets done. So the best way of doing it is to have if you have a template for your user stories, you actually have a section that will say whether or not you need to record anything. And if the product owners are really up to speed and they understand everything I've just explained and how important it is to sort of have some sort of consistency and I guess design across it, they will then choose what they want to measure and what the events are. And then it's just so much easier, because what I've seen in the past is otherwise the dev just guesses, or sometimes they're not even asked to record an event, so they just make up what they're going to record, what they think might be useful. And there's some value in that as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, but really, product need to own that whole analytics story, if you like.
I suppose a linked question here: how do you get your customer to plan for this rather than the more typical, we need to track something, not sure what?
Yeah, so that's very much a case of if they're not doing that, and obviously if you're in a tech role, it's not actually your responsibility. So you're playing more of an influencing part. But what you can do is go back to them and ask them, what are your KPIs? Start with the KPIs, and then try and get them to see that actually, if there's things that they're setting out to achieve, and normally that's what the KPIs measure, not always, but hopefully, then the changes they're making, they really need to understand whether or not they're getting them closer to that goal or not. And I think it's similar to what I was showing on the A/B testing. I mean, when you're making these changes, you're not just, and this is a very scientific way of looking at it, but you're not just moving things around on a hunch. I mean, you can do it in a much more focused and I guess targeted way, and you're moving them around because you're trying to achieve a specific outcome. And I think sort of helping them by starting with the KPIs and then showing how you can get that tracking plan and actually move that into a measurement that you're going to make gets them over the line.
So how much would you need to change code that wasn't already set up to use in Google Analytics? And once set up, are there still some changes required to code if you want to add or remove certain events to track?
Not so much with Google Tag Manager, because that's what that's designed to do. So as long as your event names remain the same, or your triggers remain the same in the code, then Google Tag Manager will cope with changing app and still be able to record those interactions. So it's really there to minimize the impact of changes and also reduce the need for developers to do extra code to change how things are recorded.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple more questions. If anybody has any further questions, do please put them into the chat function now. How do you manage updating tags in Google Tag Manager if you have a rapidly changing front end?
Well, it's just all done in the UI. I mean, it's completely designed around that. So just go in and you can create your tags. A non-technical person, once they're used to using the tool, they can easily go in and do that. And they literally have drop downs where they can choose the condition that's going to cause the trigger to fire.
And here's a nice one. What is your favorite report in Google Analytics?
The one that I find the most fascinating is the demographics. So Google brought this in about 3 years ago, I think, and what it does is it takes the users and using some of those IDs I mentioned actually, and looks at their use of Google search and Gmail and other tools, and builds up a profile of what that user is, like how old they are, what their interests are, whether they're male or female or whatever, all those kind of things. And you it does it in an aggregated way. It doesn't put any of this data into the raw data, but it can show you whether or not your application is popular with teenagers, for example, or things like that. And I don't think it's 100% accurate. I mean, I have some sort of skepticism about it because it seems almost too good to be true. But it is a fascinating area to go in, and it's data that you never would have been able to get in analytics before.
Well, that's the end of the questions, Matt. So thank you for what has been a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. There's a great deal of material there for us all to take away from the session. We will share the recording, particularly for one or two people who I understand had difficulties with the sound, but the recording will be fine. And if you think of further questions, do please send them in for Matt, and we will make sure that they are forwarded to Matt for a reply. He's very kindly agreed to do that. In the meantime, do please complete the survey when you close this GoToWebinar session, and give us your feedback when an email asking for it lands in your inbox in an hour's time. It's very important that we understand how we can continue to improve these sessions. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for attending. Thank you once again to InfinityWorks, and thank you, of course, to Matt, and good night.
Thanks.